Welcome. This is part 1 of the BCBA 6th edition Quick Study Guide walkthrough. Part 1 covers domains A through E, foundations, concepts and principles, measurement, experimental design, and ethics. If you want the PDF open while watching, you can get it free on our website at bcbmockexam.com on the BCBA 6th edition study guide page. Use the PDF as your map. Use this video as the teaching layer. And use the comments like a study log. If there is a word you want slowed down, comment that word. Reinforcement, IOA, motivating operation, ethics, measurement, or any term from the guide. I use those comments to decide which words need the slowest walkthrough in the next video. For every concept, listen for 3 things. What it means, what it looks like in a real case, and what trap answer is usually confused with. That is exam decision-making. When I say pause, actually pause for 1 sentence and choose before I explain. That is how this becomes exam practice, not background audio. Now let's start with the exam map. Start with the score map. The BCBA exam is not evenly distributed across all areas, so do not study the task list as if every area deserves equal time. Some areas carry more scored content. Concepts and principles matter because they're the language of everything else. Measurement tells you whether behavior changed. Ethics frames what a BCBA can and should do. Use the guide to find weak domains, not just to read page 1 to page 18 and feel productive. If you miss a mock exam question, do not only ask, what was the correct answer? Ask, what concept cluster produced this miss? And if that cluster keeps showing up, comment the word. That helps me know what needs a slower explanation. That turns wrong answers into a review plan. Build vocabulary before practice questions. Practice questions are powerful, but only after the core language is stable. If the vocabulary is shaky, practice questions can feel random. You might choose the answer that sounds familiar instead of the answer that matches the controlling detail in the stem. Quick checkpoint. If you cannot explain a term without looking at answer choices, more questions will not fix that term yet. That is why part 1 starts with the foundation. First, we build the scientific worldview, then the core principles, then measurement and experimental design, then ethics, because ethical judgment shapes what we do with everything else. Now we move into Domain A. Domain A, foundations. Domain A is small in percentage, but it is not small in importance. It gives you the worldview behind ABA. When a question tests Domain A, it is often testing whether you can think like a behavior analyst instead of accepting vague labels, internal explanations, or pretty-sounding procedures. The exam move for this section is simple. Prefer observable behavior. Prefer environmental variables. Prefer data. Prefer explanations that can guide action. Use Domain A as a filter. If an answer explains behavior with a label instead of a variable, slow down before you choose it. Determinism. Determinism means behavior is lawful. In plain English, behavior does not just happen out of nowhere. It is influenced by variables. For example, if a learner screams when difficult tasks are presented, a behavior analyst does not stop at he is unpredictable. We look for the antecedents, the consequences, and the history that make that behavior more likely. The exam cue is wording about behavior having causes, being lawful, or being related to environmental variables. The trap is thinking determinism means blaming the client. It does not. It means behavior can be analyzed. Memory line. If behavior is lawful, our job is to find the variables. Empiricism. Empiricism means we rely on observation and data. In plain English, do not build a plan only from opinion, tradition, or what someone thinks is happening. For example, a team may say a student is lazy. An empirical approach replaces that label with observable data, such as latency to start tasks, task completion, and what happens after refusal. The exam cue is direct observation, measurement, evidence, or data-based decision-making. The trap is treating professional opinion as evidence by itself. A professional opinion can be useful, but in ABA, the opinion has to be checked against what was observed, counted, timed, or graphed. Memory line. Show me what was observed. Parsimony. Parsimony means start with the simplest explanation that fits the facts. It does not mean choose a simplistic answer. It means do not add extra assumptions before the data require them. For example, before saying a child refuses work because of a complex internal trait, check whether refusal has been reinforced by escape from demands. The exam cue is the simplest explanation consistent with the data. The trap is over-explaining. Many wrong answers sound sophisticated, but they add causes the question never established. Memory line. Use the least complicated explanation that still fits the facts. Philosophic doubt. Philosophic doubt means keep questioning conclusions. In plain English, do not become loyal to your first explanation. For example, a behavior plan seems effective for 2 weeks. Then the data change. A BCBA practitioner with philosophic doubt reassesses the situation instead of defending the original plan. The exam cue is scientific skepticism, revising conclusions, or continuing to question even accepted facts. The trap is thinking this means indecision. It does not. It means disciplined openness to better evidence. Memory line. Good science does not marry its first explanation. Pragmatism. Pragmatism means truth is judged by practical effect. In AB exam language, this often means asking whether the explanation or intervention actually works in the real context. For example, a procedure might look elegant on paper, but if caregivers cannot implement it consistently at home, it may not be the best choice. The exam cue is useful outcomes, practical effect, prediction, and context fit. The trap is thinking pragmatism means doing whatever is easiest. It does not. It means choosing what is effective and workable. Memory line. The best plan is the one that works in the real environment. Radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism includes private events as behavior. Private events include things like thinking and feeling. The important point is that radical behaviorism does not use private events as a stopping point for analysis. For example, a learner may feel anxious. That can matter. But the behavior analyst still looks at observable antecedents, behavior, consequences, and learning history. The exam cue is private events being included without abandoning environmental explanation. The trap is thinking radical behaviorism ignores thoughts and feelings. It does not ignore them. It treats them as behavior too. Memory line. Private events matter, but they are not magic explanations. Methodological behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism focuses on publicly observable behavior. In plain English, this view draws a tighter boundary around what can be studied scientifically. For example, a report may limit conclusions only to what observers can see and measure directly. The exam cue is excluding private events from scientific analysis. The trap is mixing it up with radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism is broader because it includes private events. Methodological behaviorism is more observable only. Memory line. Methodological behaviorism draws the observable-only boundary. Mentalism. Mentalism explains behavior by internal labels instead of functional variables. For example, saying he hits because he is angry can be mentalistic if the explanation stops there. The exam cue is an inner label, emotion, trait, or state being used as the cause of behavior without functional evidence. The trap is that mentalistic explanations feel natural. In everyday language, we use them all the time. But on the exam, the question is usually asking for the functional explanation. What happened before? What happened after? What consequence has maintained the behavior? Memory line. A label is not a functional explanation. Explanatory fiction. Explanatory fiction is a circular explanation. It restates the behavior as its own cause. For example, he refuses because he is non-compliant. How do we know he is non-compliant? Because he refuses. That sounds like an explanation, but does not predict anything, measure anything, or tell us what to do. The exam cue is a label that simply renames the behavior. The trap is choosing an answer because it sounds clinical. Memory line. If the explanation is just the behavior with a new label, reject it. Selectionism. Selectionism means behavior is selected by consequences. You can think of it across 3 levels: phylogenic, onogenic, and cultural. For exam decisions, The most common application is learning history. A response increases because past consequences made it more likely. For example, amend increases because it produces access to preferred items. The exam cue is selection by consequences or behavior shaped by history. The trap is limiting selectionism only to biological evolution. In ABA, consequences also select behavior across an individual's learning history. Memory line. Consequences select future behavior. Applied. Applied means the behavior has social importance. In plain English, the target should matter in the learner's real life. Teaching a learner to request help can be applied because it improves daily communication. The exam cue is whether the target matters to the learner, family, school, workplace, or community. The trap is choosing applied just because a procedure is ABA. The procedure can be behavior analytic, but the target still has to be socially important. Memory line. Social importance is the test. Behavioral. Behavioral means the target is observable and measurable. A goal like improve attitude is not behavioral enough. A goal like completes 3 math problems after the instruction is observable. The exam cue is measurable action verbs and clear response definitions. The trap is a goal that sounds important but cannot be observed reliably. Ask yourself, could 2 observers agree that it happened? Memory line. If observers cannot see it, define it better. Analytic. Analytic means you can demonstrate control over behavior. In plain English, the data and design show that the intervention, not something else, caused the change. For example, in a reversal design, behavior changes when a contingency is introduced, withdrawn, and reintroduced. The exam cue is functional relation, experimental control, or ruling out alternative explanations. The trap is assuming improvement alone is enough. Behavior getting better is good, but analytic asks whether we can show why it changed. Memory line. Analytic means we can show why the change occurred. Technological. Technological means procedures are written clearly enough to be replicated. If another trained person could follow the written plan and implement it the same way, the procedure is technological. For example, a plan specifies the prompt hierarchy, reinforcement schedule, correction procedure, and criteria for moving forward. The exam cue is replication, exact procedure, or complete description. The trap is general advice. Use prompts and reinforcement is not technological enough. Memory line. Could someone else run it from the written plan? Conceptually systematic. Conceptually systematic means procedures are connected to behavioral principles. In plain English, it is not a bag of tricks. For example, a token system should be explained through conditioned reinforcement, backup reinforcers, and exchange contingencies. The exam cue is linking a procedure to ABA principles. The trap is choosing a branded method or popular strategy without naming the principle behind it. Memory line. Name the principle behind the tactic. Effective. Effective means the behavior change is large enough to matter. A graph can show movement without showing meaningful improvement. For example, tantrums dropping from 12 per day to 10 per day might be statistically noticeable, but it may not be effective for the family. The exam cue is meaningful magnitude, practical improvement, or socially important change. The trap is treating any data change as effectiveness. Memory line. Did life get better in automatter? Generality. Generality means behavior change lasts, transfers, or spreads. It may last over time. It may appear in new settings. It may occur with different people, or it may spread to related behaviors. For example, a greeting taught in therapy begins to occur at school and continues after services fade. The exam cue is maintenance, setting transfer, people transfer, or response spread. The trap is confusing acquisition in one setting with generality. Memory line. Real change travels and lasts. Domain A wrap. Here is the big picture for Domain A. The exam is testing whether you can think scientifically. Find variables. Use data. Prefer simple explanations first. Keep questioning. Choose practical interventions. Avoid mentalistic labels. And make sure behavior change is observable, meaningful, and durable. Before moving on, Pause and say the domain A rule in your own words. Observable, measurable, useful, and durable. Now we move into domain B, where the vocabulary becomes much more technical. Domain B, concepts and principles. Domain B is one of the most important areas because it gives you the language for the rest of the exam. If domain B is weak, later domains feel harder than they actually are. The exam often puts two familiar terms next to each other. Your job is not to pick the familiar term. Your job is to identify the controlling detail. Is something added or removed? Does behavior go up or down? Is the issue value or availability? Is the consequence automatic or socially mediated? Keep those questions active. Positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means a stimulus is added after behavior, and future behavior increases. Positive means added. It does not mean good. For example, a learner asks for help. The teacher gives help. In the future, the learner asks for help more often. The exam cue is something delivered after the response, followed by an increase in future behavior. The trap is deciding by whether the consequence sounds pleasant. Do not do that. Decide by added versus removed, and behavior up versus behavior down. Memory line. Added after behavior, behavior goes up. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement means a stimulus is removed or delayed after behavior, and future behavior increases. Negative means removed. It does not mean bad. For example, a child screams during math. The worksheet is removed. Screaming increases during math in the future. The exam cue is escape, avoidance, delay, or removal, plus future behavior increasing. The trap is confusing negative reinforcement with punishment because the word negative sounds unpleasant. Pause on this case. The worksheet was removed and screaming increased later. That is reinforcement, even though the behavior is a problem. Memory line. Removed after behavior, behavior goes up. Positive punishment. Positive punishment means a stimulus is added after behavior, and future behavior decreases. For example, a reprimand follows blurting, and blurting decreases in the future. The exam cue is stimulus added after behavior, with behavior decreasing later. The trap is assuming a reprimand is automatically punishment. It might function as attention and increase behavior. Always check the future effect. Memory line. Added after behavior, behavior goes down. Negative punishment. Negative punishment means a stimulus is removed after behavior, and future behavior decreases. For example, a token is removed after aggression, and aggression decreases in the future. The exam cue is loss, removal, response cost, or timeout, with behavior decreasing. The trap is calling every removal negative punishment. If behavior does not decrease, it did not function as punishment. Memory line. Removed after behavior, behavior goes down. Motivating operation. A motivating operation, or MO, changes the value of a reinforcer and changes behavior related to that reinforcer. In plain English, MO is about how much the consequence matters right now. For example, skipping lunch makes food more valuable and makes food-seeking behavior more likely. The exam cue is value-altering plus behavior-altering effects. The big trap is MO versus SD. MO changes value. SD signal availability. Ask it this way. Did hunger make food more valuable, or did the open sign signal that food was available here? Memory line. MOS change how much the consequence matters. Establishing operation. An establishing operation is an MO that increases the value of a reinforcer and evokes behavior that has produced it. For example, water deprivation makes water more valuable and evokes asking for water. The exam cue is increased value and increased related behavior. The trap is treating EO as a consequence. It is not. It happens before behavior and changes motivation. Memory line. EO turns the value up. Abolishing operation. An abolishing operation is an MO that decreases the value of a reinforcer and abates related behavior. For example, after a full meal, food is less valuable and food requests decrease. The exam cue is decreased value and reduced related behavior. The trap is choosing A-O when the real issue is availability. If the question says reinforcement is not available, think stimulus control, not motivation. Memory line. A-O turns the value down. Discriminative stimulus. A discriminative stimulus, or SD, signals that reinforcement is available for a behavior because of history. For example, an open sign signals that entering the store can produce service. The exam cue is availability of reinforcement for a response. The trap is confusing SD with MO. The SD does not make the reinforcer more valuable. It signals that this response can work here. Memory line. SD means now this response can work. S delta. An S delta signals that reinforcement is not available for a response. For example, a closed sign signals that entering the store will not produce service. The exam cue is extinction condition or reinforcement unavailable. The trap is calling it punishment. S delta does not necessarily decrease behavior by adding or removing a consequence. It signals that the response will not contact reinforcement in that context. Memory line. This response will not pay off here. Unconditioned reinforcer. An unconditioned reinforcer is effective without a learning history. Food, water, warmth, and pain reduction are common examples, depending on the person's state and context. The exam cue is primary or unlearned reinforcer. The trap is assuming these always function the same way. MOS still matter. Food is not equally reinforcing before and after a full meal. Memory line. No teaching history required. Conditioned reinforcer. A conditioned reinforcer becomes reinforcing through pairing. For example, praise may become reinforcing after it is repeatedly paired with attention, success, or other reinforcers. The exam cue is learned value or pairing. The trap is forgetting that conditioned reinforcers can lose value if they are not maintained. Memory line. Learn value through pairing. Generalized conditioned reinforcer. A generalized conditioned reinforcer is paired with many backup reinforcers. That makes it less dependent on one specific MO. Money and token points are common examples because they can access many things. The exam cue is many backup reinforcers or broad exchange value. The trap is calling any learned reinforcer generalized. A single paired item may be conditioned, but not generalized. Memory line. Many backups make it flexible. Automatic reinforcement. Automatic reinforcement means the behavior itself produces the reinforcing consequence without another person mediating it. For example, hand flapping may produce sensory stimulation that maintains the behavior. The exam cue is a consequence produced directly by the response. The trap is assuming all stereotypy is automatic. Do not guess function from topography. Assess it. Memory line. The behavior contacts its own payoff. Socially mediated reinforcement. Socially mediated reinforcement means another person delivers or removes the consequence. For example, a student yells. The teacher gives attention or removes work. If yelling increases, the consequence was socially mediated. The exam cue is another person arranging the outcome. The trap is focusing only on whether the consequence is attention, escape, or access. First ask whether someone else mediated it. Memory line. Someone else delivers a payoff. Extinction. Extinction means withholding the maintaining reinforcer for a previously reinforced behavior. The key phrase is maintaining reinforcer. For example, if tantrums are escape maintained, extinction means tantrums no longer produce task removal. The exam cue is the specific reinforcer being withheld. The trap is thinking extinction means ignoring. Ignoring is only extinction for attention-maintained behavior. Do not choose extinction until you know the function. Extinction is not a vibe. It is withholding the specific reinforcer that has been maintaining the behavior. Memory line. Extinction must match the function. Extinction burst. An extinction burst is a temporary increase in frequency, intensity, or variability after extinction begins. For example, when crying no longer produces candy, crying may become louder before it decreases. The exam cue is initial worsening after reinforcement is withheld. The trap is assuming the plan failed just because behavior got worse at first. Safety still matters, but an initial burst can be expected when the old payoff stops. Memory line. Behavior often pushes harder when the old payoff stops. Escape function. Escape function means behavior is maintained by removal or avoidance of demands or aversive events. For example, throwing materials results in being sent out of class. The exam cue is work removed, breaks, delays, avoidance, or demands ending after behavior. The trap is treating escape behavior with attention extinction alone. If the maintaining reinforcer is escape, the treatment must address escape. Memory line. The payoff is getting away from something. Attention function. Attention function means behavior is maintained by social attention. For example, a child interrupts, adults scold, and interrupting increases. The exam cue is eye contact, reprimands, conversation, comforting, or other social response after behavior. The trap is assuming attention has to be positive in tone. Reprimands can still function as attention if they maintain behavior. Memory line. Attention is attention if it maintains behavior. Access function. Access function means behavior is maintained by access to tangibles or activities. For example, screaming produces the tablet, and screaming increases near the tablet. The exam cue is an item, activity, or preferred event delivered after behavior. The trap is treating the problem as only a compliance issue. Often the intervention needs communication training and reinforcement thinning. Memory line. The payoff is getting something. Automatic function. Automatic function means behavior is maintained by sensory consequences produced by the behavior itself. For example, scratching may produce stimulation or relief independent of social consequences. The exam cue is behavior continuing when social consequences are not present. The trap is guessing automatic function from how behavior looks. You still need assessment and sometimes medical consultation. Memory line. The consequence is built into the response. Continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement means every occurrence of the response is reinforced. For example, every correct tact receives immediate praise during early teaching. The exam cue is each response being reinforced. The trap is using continuous reinforcement forever. It is often useful during acquisition, but it is commonly thinned later for maintenance. Memory line. Every correct response gets paid. Fixed ratio. Fixed ratio means reinforcement after a set number of responses. For example, FR5 means every fifth correct response produces reinforcement. The exam cue is a predictable response count. The trap is mixing up ratio and interval. Ratio counts responses. Interval tracks time. Memory line. Count responses, fixed number. Variable ratio. Variable ratio means reinforcement after an average number of responses. For example, VR5 means reinforcement averages every 5 responses, but the exact number varies. The exam cue is an average response count. The trap is thinking variable means random with no pattern. It still has an average schedule requirement. Memory line. Count responses, variable number. Fixed interval. Fixed interval means the first response after a set amount of time is reinforced. For example, FI 10 minutes means the first response after 10 minutes contacts reinforcement. The exam cue is predictable time. The trap is thinking every response after the interval gets reinforced. The key is the first response after the interval has passed. Memory line. Time passes, then the first response works. Variable interval. Variable interval means the first response after varying amounts of time is reinforced. For example, VI 10 minutes means the interval averages 10 minutes, but the exact time varies. The exam cue is average time interval. The trap is confusing it with variable ratio. Ratio counts responses. Interval tracks time. Memory line. Time varies, then the first response works. Meng. Amend is a verbal operand controlled by an M, O, and reinforced by a specific consequence. In plain English, amend is requesting. For example, a thirsty learner says water and receives water. The exam cue is a request plus specific reinforcement. The trap is calling every word a man. Check the controlling variable. If the learner wants the item and saying the word produces it, think man. The word itself is not enough. The controlling variable is the answer. Memory line. Mans are needs and wants an action. Tact. A tact is controlled by a nonverbal stimulus and maintained by generalized reinforcement. In plain English, a tact labels something in the environment. For example, a child sees a dog and says dog. The adult says, yes, that's a dog. The exam cue is labeling something present. The trap is confusing tact with man. If the child says dog because they want the dog toy, that may be a man. If they label a dog they see, that is a tact. Memory line. Tacts label the world. Echoic. An echoic is a vocal response with point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity to a vocal model. In plain English, someone says a sound or word, and the learner repeats the same spoken sound or word. For example, the teacher says ball. The learner says ball. The exam cue is repeating spoken words. The trap is forgetting formal similarity. Vocal model, vocal response. Memory line. Hear it, say the same thing. Intraverbal. An intraverbal is a verbal response controlled by a verbal stimulus without point-to-point correspondence. In plain English, it is answering or conversing. For example, the teacher asks, "What do you eat?" The learner says, "Apple." The exam cue is answering questions, fill-ins, or conversation. The trap is calling it echoic when the response does not copy the stimulus exactly. Memory line. Verbal stimulus in, different verbal response out. Textual. Textual behavior is reading written words aloud. The written stimulus controls a vocal response. For example, the printed word cat appears, and the learner says cat. The exam cue is written to vocal responding. The trap is assuming textual behavior means reading comprehension. Reading aloud is textual. Understanding what was read involves additional behavior. Memory line. See text, say words. Transcription. Transcription means writing or typing what is heard. For example, the teacher says dog, and the learner writes dog. The exam cue is spoken word to written response. The trap is confusing transcription with copying text. Copying is controlled by a written stimulus, not a spoken one. Memory line. Hear words, write words. Stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization means the same response occurs in the presence of similar stimuli. For example, a child learns to say dog for the family dog, then also says dog when seeing other dogs. The exam cue is the same response spreading across similar stimuli. The trap is confusing it with response generalization. Stimulus generalization changes the stimuli. Response generalization changes the responses. Memory line. Same response, new similar stimuli. Response generalization. Response generalization means untrained but related responses occur. For example, after learning to ask for help with one phrase, a learner begins using other appropriate help requests. The exam cue is new forms of behavior that serve a related function. The trap is choosing stimulus generalization when the stimulus changed. Here, the response form changes. Memory line. New response, same general purpose. Discrimination. Discrimination means responding differently in the presence of different stimuli. For example, a learner says dog when seeing a dog and does not say dog when seeing a cat. The exam cue is different responses under different stimulus conditions. The trap is thinking discrimination is a negative social word. In ABA, it means behavior comes under appropriate stimulus control. Memory line. Different cues, different responding. Domain B wrap. Domain B is where many candidates either gain confidence or lose it. The exam is usually not asking whether you recognize the term. It is asking whether you can separate closed concepts. Added or removed. Behavior up or down. Value or availability. Response counter time. Request, label, repeat, answer, read, or write. If you can ask the right sorting question, Domain B becomes much more manageable. If one pair still blurs for you, comment the pair. MO versus SD, man versus tact, or reinforcement versus punishment. Now, we move into measurement. Domain C, measurement. Measurement answers one basic question: what changed? If behavior is not measured well, the rest of the analysis becomes shaky. Domain C is not just about definitions. It is about choosing the right measurement system for the behavior and knowing what each system can distort. The exam move is to ask, what dimension of behavior matters here? Frequency? Time? Delay? The space between responses? Or a sample of occurrence within intervals? If the behavior has a clear beginning and end, duration may matter. If it is a quick countable response, frequency may matter. The stem usually tells you what dimension is important. Count. Count is the number of times behavior occurs. For example, a student raises their hand 12 times during class. The exam cue is total occurrences. The trap is using count when observation time differs. 12 responses in 10 minutes and 12 responses in 2 hours do not mean the same thing. Memory line. Count tells how many. Rate. Rate is count per unit of time. For example, 20 responses in 10 minutes equals 2 responses per minute. The exam cue is frequency adjusted for time. The trap is confusing count with rate. If sessions are different lengths, rate is often more useful. Memory line. Rate tells how many per time. Duration. Duration measures how long behavior lasts. For example, a tantrum lasts 7 minutes. The exam cue is behavior with meaningful length of occurrence. The trap is counting episodes when the real concern is time engaged in behavior. Memory line. Duration asks how long. Latency. Latency measures the time between an instruction or stimulus and the start of behavior. For example, after the teacher says begin, the learner starts writing after 30 seconds. The exam cue is delay before responding. The trap is confusing latency with duration. Latency is before the response starts. Duration is how long the response lasts. Memory line. Latency asks how long until it starts. Inter-response time. Inter-response time measures the time between two responses. For example, 10 seconds pass between one hand raise and the next. The exam cue is spacing between responses. The trap is confusing it with latency. Latency starts from a stimulus. Inter-response time is between responses. Memory line. IRT asks how long between responses. Whole interval recording. Whole interval recording scores behavior only if it occurs during the entire interval. For example, if on-task behavior must occur for the whole 30 seconds, and it stops for 5 seconds, that interval is not scored. The exam cue is behavior must happen for the whole interval. The trap is forgetting the bias. Whole interval recording tends to underestimate behavior. Memory line. Whole interval is strict. Partial interval recording. Partial interval recording scores behavior if it occurs at any point during the interval. For example, aggression occurs for 2 seconds in a 30-second interval, and the interval is scored. The exam cue is any occurrence during the interval. The trap is forgetting the bias. Partial interval recording tends to overestimate behavior. Memory line. Partial interval is broad. Momentary time sampling. Momentary time sampling scores whether behavior is occurring at the exact moment the interval ends. For example, the observer checks at the end of each minute and records whether the learner is on task at that instant. The exam cue is checking at a moment, not throughout the whole interval. The trap is thinking it captures everything that happened during the interval. It can miss behavior between checks. Memory line. Momentary sampling to Kisa's snapshot. Continuous measurement. Continuous measurement captures every instance of the target behavior during observation. Count, rate, duration, latency, and IRT can be continuous measures. The exam cue is every occurrence being measured. The trap is assuming continuous measurement is always required. It is stronger when feasible, but some situations require sampling. Memory line. Continuous tries to catch every event. Discontinuous measurement. Discontinuous measurement samples behavior. Whole interval, partial interval, and momentary time sampling are common examples. The exam cue is interval recording or sampling. The trap is forgetting that discontinuous systems can distort estimates. Know the direction of the bias. Memory line. Discontinuous samples, so check the bias. Inter-observer agreement. Inter-observer agreement, or IOA, measures the extent to which observers agree. For example, two observers independently record aggression and compare their data. The exam cue is agreement between observers. The trap is treating IOA as proof that the data are accurate. Agreement helps, but two observers can agree and still be wrong if the definition is poor. Pause here because this one steals points. High agreement does not automatically mean high accuracy. Memory line. IOA checks agreement, not perfect truth. Accuracy. Accuracy means the data reflect the true value of the behavior. For example, if the true count is 10 and the recorded count is 10, the data are accurate. The exam cue is closeness to the true value. The trap is confusing accuracy with IOA. IOA is observer agreement. Accuracy is agreement with the actual value. Memory line. Accuracy asks whether the data are correct. Level. Level is the value of the data on the vertical axis. In plain English, it tells how high or low the behavior is. For example, aggression averaging 8 times per session is a higher level than aggression averaging 1 time per session. The exam cue is mean, median, or overall vertical position. The trap is confusing level with trend. Level is how much. Trend is direction. Memory line. Level tells where the data sit. Trend. Trend is the direction of the data path. It may increase, decrease, or stay relatively flat. For example, prompts needed per session move from 10 to 7 to 4 to 2. That is a decreasing trend. The exam cue is direction across time. The trap is calling a high level a trend. A high level is not necessarily increasing. Memory line. Trend tells where the data are going. Variability. Variability is how much the data bounce around. For example, behavior rates of 2, 9, 3, 11, and 4 show more variability than rates of 5, 5, 6, 5, and 6. The exam cue is stability, bounce, scatter, or data path consistency. The trap is ignoring variability when evaluating effects. High variability can make interpretation harder. Memory line. Variability tells how much the data move around. Domain CRAP. Measurement is where precision starts. If the question asks what to measure, think about the behavior's dimension. If it asks how trustworthy the data are, think about accuracy and IOA. If it asks how to read a graph, think level, trend, and variability. And if it asks about interval recording, remember the bias. Whole interval tends to underestimate. Partial interval tends to overestimate. Momentary time sampling can miss behavior between checks. If measurement bias is one of your weak spots, write down which one still gets you. Whole interval, partial interval, or momentary time sampling. Now we move into experimental design. Domain D, experimental design. Experimental design answers a different question from measurement. Measurement asks, what happened? Design asks, can we show why it happened? That difference matters. A graph can show improvement, but design logic tells us whether the intervention likely caused the improvement. The exam move is to identify the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the design logic that supports a functional relation. Independent variable. The independent variable is what the researcher or practitioner manipulates. In intervention terms, it is often the procedure being introduced or changed. For example, a procedure is introduced to see whether aggression decreases. The exam cue is the intervention, condition, or variable being manipulated. The trap is confusing it with the behavior being measured. Memory line. The IV is what we change. Dependent variable. The dependent variable is the behavior being measured. For example, aggression per session is the dependent variable when testing an intervention to reduce aggression. The exam cue is the measured outcome. The trap is confusing the target behavior with the intervention. The target behavior is the DV. The intervention is the IV. Memory line. The DV is what we measure. Baseline. Baseline is measurement before intervention. It shows the existing pattern of behavior before the independent variable is introduced. For example, The team records aggression for several sessions before starting the intervention. The exam cue is pre-intervention data or current performance level. The trap is treating baseline as wasted time. Baseline is what lets us compare change after intervention. Memory line. Baseline shows what happens before we change something. Functional relation. A functional relation means changes in the independent variable reliably produce changes in the dependent variable. In plain English, the design shows that the intervention caused the behavior change. The exam cue is experimental control or repeated demonstration of effect. The trap is assuming correlation is enough. Behavior improved after an intervention, but that does not automatically prove the intervention caused it. Look for repeated demonstration. If the effect appears only once, the exam may be testing whether you can separate improvement from experimental control. Memory line. Functional relation means the change follows the variable we manipulated. Reversal design. A reversal design demonstrates control by introducing and removing the intervention. For example, behavior is high in baseline, decreases with intervention, increases when intervention is removed, and decreases again when intervention returns. The exam cue is AB or withdrawal and reintroduction. The trap is choosing reversal when it would be unethical or impractical to remove an effective intervention. Memory line. Remove and return the intervention to test control. Multiple baseline design. Multiple baseline design demonstrates control by a staggering intervention across behaviors, settings, or participants. For example, the intervention starts with one student while others remain in baseline, then starts later with another student. The exam cue is staggered introduction. The trap is thinking multiple baseline requires withdrawing treatment. It is not. Memory line. Stagger the start to show the effect. Alternating treatments design. Alternating treatments design compares two or more interventions by rapidly alternating conditions. For example, two teaching methods are alternated across sessions to see which produces faster acquisition. The exam cue is rapid comparison of conditions. The trap is using it when carryover effects would make comparison unclear. Memory line. Alternate conditions to compare effects. Changing criterion design. Changing criterion design demonstrates control through stepwise changes in the performance criterion. For example, a goal changes from 5 minutes on task to 10 to 15, and behavior changes with each criterion. The exam cue is gradual criterion shifts. The trap is choosing it for behavior that should change immediately or cannot be shaped by steps. Memory line. Behavior follows the moving criterion. Internal validity. Internal validity is confidence that the independent variable caused the change in the dependent variable. In plain English, can we trust the cause? The exam cue is ruling out alternative explanations like history, maturation, or confounds. The trap is focusing only on good-looking data. Strong internal validity depends on design logic, not just improvement. Memory line. Can we trust the cause? External validity. External validity is the extent to which findings generalize beyond the original conditions. For example, a procedure effective in clinic also works at home and school. The exam cue is generalization to other people, settings, behaviors, or conditions. The trap is trading away internal validity too quickly. First show the effect, then ask how far it travels. Memory line. Does it travel beyond this case? Confound. A confound is an uncontrolled variable that may explain the behavior change. For example, an intervention starts the same week a medication changes. Now it is harder to know what caused the behavior change. The exam cue is an alternative explanation. The trap is ignoring timing. If another major variable changed at the same time, causation is less clear. Memory line. A confound is a competing cause. Baseline logic. Baseline logic uses prediction, verification, and replication to demonstrate experimental control. Prediction means baseline data suggest what behavior would do without intervention. Verification means returning to baseline or maintaining other baseline supports that prediction. Replication means the effect is repeated. The exam cue is prediction, verification, and replication. The trap is memorizing the words without understanding the flow. Baseline logic is how single-case design shows that the intervention, not coincidence, change behavior. Memory line, predict, verify, replicate. Domain DRAP. Experimental design is not just a research topic. It is a logic behind saying, this procedure worked. On the exam, always separate the behavior from the intervention. The behavior is the dependent variable. The intervention is the independent variable. Then ask which design shows control and whether alternative explanations have been ruled out. When two answer choices both name real designs, do not pick the one you recognize first. Pick the one whose logic actually demonstrates the effect in that scenario. Now we move into ethics. Domain E ethics. Ethics is not a separate world from clinical work. It shapes every decision. In exam questions, ethics often appears through words like first, best, next, appropriate, document, consent, scope, risk, client welfare, and supervision. The safest answer is rarely the fastest-looking answer. It is usually the answer that protects client welfare, respects rights, stays within competence, documents carefully, and follows appropriate consultation or supervision. Think of ethics questions as sequencing questions. What protects the client and the process before you act? Scope of competence. Scope of competence means practicing only in areas where you have appropriate training, experience, and supervision. For example, a BCBA should not accept a case requiring specialized expertise without the needed competence or support. The exam cue is a professional being asked to work outside their training. The trap is choosing the answer that sounds helpful but ignores competence. Ethical practice is not just willingness to help. It is helping within your ability to do so responsibly. Memory line. Do not practice beyond competence. Informed consent. Informed consent means clients or authorized decision-makers understand and agree to services, risks, benefits, and alternatives. For example, before starting an assessment or intervention, the practitioner explains what will happen, how data will be used, and what choices the client has. The exam cue is permission, understanding, risks, benefits, alternatives, and voluntary agreement. The trap is treating consent as a one-time signature. Consent should be meaningful and informed. Memory line. Consent requires understanding, not just a form. Right to refuse. Right to refuse means clients have the right to decline services or procedures within relevant legal and safety boundaries. For example, a caregiver or client objects to a proposed procedure. The BCBA should not simply push ahead because the plan is behavior analytic. The exam cue is refusal, withdrawal, objection, or assent concerns. The trap is choosing the answer that prioritizes treatment speed over rights. Memory line. Effective treatment still respects client choice. Confidentiality. Confidentiality means protecting client information. For example, client data should not be discussed in public spaces or shared with unauthorized people. The exam cue is records, identifying information, sharing data, privacy, or communication with third parties. The trap is assuming good intentions allow disclosure. Even helpful sharing needs authorization and appropriate safeguards. Memory line. Protect the information that identifies the client. Multiple relationship. A multiple relationship occurs when there is more than one role with the same person or related parties. For example, a supervisor also becomes a close personal friend or business partner with a supervisee. The exam cue is overlapping professional and personal roles. The trap is assuming the relationship is acceptable because everyone agrees. The concern is impaired judgment, exploitation risk, and conflicts. Memory line. One professional role is cleaner than two competing roles. Conflict of interest. A conflict of interest occurs when personal, financial, or professional interests could interfere with objective judgment. For example, recommending a service because the provider benefits financially can create a conflict if it is not handled transparently. The exam cue is personal gain, competing interests, referrals, gifts, or biased decision-making. The trap is ignoring disclosure and safeguards. Memory line. If another interest can bias the decision, treat EAT as a risk. Mandated reporting. Mandated reporting refers to legal or professional duties to report suspected abuse, neglect, or other reportable concerns according to applicable law and policy. For exam purposes, do not invent legal details beyond the question. The exam cue is suspected harm, abuse, neglect, danger, or required reporting. The trap is choosing to investigate privately instead of following reporting requirements. Memory line. When reporting is required, follow the required process. Cultural humility. Cultural humility means ongoing self-reflection, learning, and respect for the client's cultural context. It is not the same as memorizing a checklist about a group. For example, a BCBA asks respectful questions about family routines and values before assuming what will fit. The exam cue is culture, values, language, family practices, or contextual fit. The trap is stereotyping. Cultural humility is individualized and ongoing. Memory line. Ask, learn, and adapt with respect. Dignity. Dignity means treating clients with respect and protecting their worth, privacy, and humanity. For example, behavior reduction procedures should not shame, humiliate, or unnecessarily restrict the person. The exam cue is respect, privacy, demeaning treatment, or client-centered decision-making. The trap is focusing only on reducing behavior while ignoring how the procedure affects the person. Memory line. Behavior change should not cost the client's dignity. Right to effective treatment. Right to effective treatment means clients deserve interventions that are evidence-based, individualized, and likely to produce meaningful benefit. For example, continuing a plan with poor data and no meaningful progress requires reassessment. The exam cue is ineffective treatment, poor progress, or need for evidence-based care. The trap is continuing services because the team is comfortable with the plan. Memory line. Clients deserve treatment that works. Least restrictive alternative. Least restrictive alternative means choosing the option that is effective while minimizing restriction, intrusiveness, and harm. For example, using reinforcement-based procedures before restrictive punishment procedures when safe and clinically appropriate. The exam cue is restrictiveness, intrusiveness, safety, and effectiveness. The trap is choosing the least restrictive option, even when it is not effective. The ethical goal is least restrictive effective intervention. Memory line. Low intrusion plus real effect. Ethical answer sequence. The ethical answer sequence is a way to slow down on exam questions. When an ethics item asks what to do first, best, or next, do not jump to the action that feels decisive. Ask this sequence. First, is there immediate risk to safety or client welfare? Second, do we have consent and authorization? Third, is this within scope of competence? Fourth, what documentation, consultation, or supervision is required? Fifth, what action protects the client's rights and produces effective treatment? The exam cue is first, best, next, appropriate, or ethical. The trap is choosing a fast clinical action before handling rights, risk, consent, scope, or documentation. If an answer feels bold but skips one of those steps, be suspicious. Memory line. Safety. Rights, competence, documentation, then action. Domain ERAP. Ethics questions often feel like common sense, but the exam is usually more precise than that. Look for the safest professional sequence. Protect client welfare. Stay within competence. Get meaningful consent. Respect refusal and dignity. Protect confidentiality. Document and consult when needed. And choose effective treatment with the least necessary restriction. Part 1 Closing. That is Part 1 of the BCBA 6th edition Quick Study Guide. We covered domains A through E, foundations, concepts and principles, measurement, experimental design, and ethics. If you only remember one thing from this walkthrough, remember this. The exam is not testing whether a term looks familiar. It is testing whether you can use the detail in the question to choose the right concept and reject the close distractor. Use the free PDF as your map. Mark the concepts you had to replay. Then test transfer with practice questions, because practice questions show whether you can apply the concept in a new STEM. You can get the free PDF on our website, bcbamockexam.com, on the BCBA 6th edition study guide page. Before you leave, comment the Part 2 domain you want the slowest walkthrough for. Comment F for assessment. Comment G for procedures. Comment H for intervention. Comment I for supervision. Part 2 will cover domains F through I, plus the exam traps that steal points when two answer choices both sound familiar. This video is an independent study resource and is not endorsed by the BACB. Always verify current exam requirements and policies with the BACB. Thanks for studying with BCBA Mock Exam. I will see you in Part 2.